The BFG, Chapter 22, The Capture. The BFG had made thousands of journeys to and from Giant Country over the years. He had never in his life made one quite like this, with 9 huge helicopters roaring just along over his head. He had never traveled in broad daylight either. He hadn't dared to. But this was different. Now he was doing it for the Queen of England herself, and he was frightened of nobody. As he galloped across the British Isles with the helicopters thundering above him, people stood and gaped and wondered what on earth was going on. They had never seen the likes of it before, and they never would again. Every now and then the pilots of the helicopters would catch a glimpse of a small girl wearing glasses crouching in the giant's right ear and waving to them. They always waved back. The pilots marveled at the giant's speed and at the way he leapt across the wide rivers and over huge houses. But they hadn't seen anything yet. "Be careful to hang on tight," the BFG said. "We is going fast as Fizzlecrump." The BFG changed into his famous top gear, and all at once he began to fly forward as though there were springs in his legs and rockets in his toes. He went skimming across the earth like some magical hop, skip, and jumper with his feet hardly ever touching the ground. As usual, Sophie had to crouch low in the crevice of his ear to save herself from being swept away clean. The 9 pilots in the helicopters suddenly realized they were being left behind. The giant was streaking ahead. They opened up their throttles full speed, and even then they were just able to keep up. In the leading machine, the head of the Air Force was sitting beside the pilot. He had a world atlas on his knees and kept staring first at the atlas and then the ground below, trying to figure out where they were going. Frantically, he turned the pages of the atlas. "Where the devil are we going?" he cried. "I haven't the foggiest idea," the pilot answered. "The Queen's orders were to follow the giant, and that's exactly what I'm doing." The pilot was a young Air Force officer with a bushy mustache. He was very proud of his mustache. He was also quite fearless, and he knew places, shouted the head of the He loved new adventures. He thought this was a super adventure. It was fun going to new places, he said. "New places," shouted the head of the Air Force. "What the blazes do you mean, new places?" "This place we're flying over isn't in the atlas, is it?" the pilot said, grinning. "You're darn right it isn't in the atlas," cried the head of the Air Force. "We've flown clear off the last page." "I expect that the old giant knows where he's going," said the young pilot. "He's leading us to disaster," cried the head of the Air Force. He was shaking with fear. In the seat behind him sat the head of the Army, who was even more terrified. "You don't mean to tell me we've gone right off of the atlas?" he cried, leaning forward to look. "That's exactly what I am telling you," cried the Air Force man. "Look for yourself. Here's the very last map in the whole flaming atlas. We went off of that an hour ago." He turned the page. As in all atlases, there were 2 completely blank pages at the very end. "So now we must be somewhere here," he said, putting a finger on one of the blank pages. "Where's here?" cried the head of the Army. The young pilot was still grinning broadly. He said to them, "That's why they always put 2 blank pages at the back of the atlas. They're for new countries. You're meant to fill them in yourself." The head of the Air Force glanced down at the ground below. "Just look at this God-forsaken desert," he cried. "All the trees are dead and all the rocks are blue." "The giant has stopped," the pilot said. "He's waving us down." The pilots throttled back the engines and all 9 helicopters landed safely on the great yellow wasteland. Then each of them lowered the ramp from its belly. 9 jeeps, 1 from each helicopter, were driven down the ramps. Each jeep contained 6 soldiers and a vast quantity of thick rope and heavy chains. "I don't see any giants," said the head of the Army. "The giants is all still just out of sight over there," the BFG told him. "But if you is taking these slosh-buckling, noisy belly poppers any closer, all the giants is waking up at once, and then pop goes the weasel." "So you want us to proceed by jeep?" the head of the Army said. "Yes," the BFG said. "But you all must be very, very hushy quiet. No roaring of motors, no shouting, no mucking about, no piggery-jokery." The BFG, with Sophie still in his ear, trotted forward, and the jeeps followed close behind. Suddenly, the most dreadful rumbling noise was heard by everyone. The head of the Army went pea-green in the face. "Those are guns!" he cried. There's a battle raging somewhere up ahead of us. Turn back, the lot of you. Get out of here. Pig squiffle, the BFG said. Those noises are not guns. Of course they're guns, shouted the head of the army. I'm a military man, and I know a gun when I hear one. Turn back. Those are just the giants snortling in their sleep, the BFG said. I is a giant myself, and I know a giant snortle when I is hearing one. Are you sure? The army man said anxiously. Positive, the BFG said. Proceed cautiously, the army man ordered. They all moved on. Then they saw them. Even at a distance, they were enough to scare the daylights out of one of the soldiers. But when they got close and saw what the giants really looked like, they began to sweat with fear. 9 fearsome, ugly, half-naked, 50-feet-long brutes lay sprawled over the ground in various grotesque attitudes of sleep, and the sound of their snoring was indeed like gunfire in a battle. The BFG raised a hand. All the jeeps stopped, and the soldiers got out. What happens if one of them wakes up? Whispered the head of the army, his knees knocking together from fear. If any of them is waking up, he will probably gobble you down before you can say knife, the BFG answered, grinning hugely. Me is the only one that won't be gobbled up, because giants is never eating giants. Me and Sophie is the only safe ones, because I is hiding her if that happens. The head of the army took several paces to the rear. So did the head of the Air Force. They climbed rather quickly back into their jeep, ready to make a fast getaway if necessary. Go forward, men, the head of the army said. Go forward and do your duty bravely. The soldiers crept forward with their ropes and chains. All of them were trembling mightily. None dared speak a word. The BFG, with Sophie now sitting on the palm of his hand, stood nearby watching the operation. To give the soldiers their due, they were extremely courageous. There were 6 well-trained, efficient men working on each giant, and within 10 minutes out of the 9 giants had been trussed up like chickens and were still snoring contentedly. The 9th, who happened to be the flesh lump eater, was causing trouble for the soldiers because he was lying with his right arm tucked underneath his enormous body. It was impossible to tie his wrists and arms together without first getting the arm out from underneath him. Very cautiously, the 6 soldiers who were working on the flesh lump eater began to pull at the huge arm, trying to release it. The flesh leader opened his tiny, piggy black eyes. Which one of you foul pesters is wiggling my arm? He bellowed. Is that you, rotsome manhugger? Suddenly, he saw the soldiers. In a flash, he was sitting up. He looked around him. He saw more soldiers. With a roar, he leapt to his feet. The soldiers, petrified with fear, froze where they were. They had no weapons with them. The head of the army put his jeep into reverse. Human beings! The flesh lump eater yelled. What is all of you flesh-bunking, rotsome, half-baked beans doing in our country? He made a grab at a soldier and swept him up in his hand. I is having early suppers tonight, he shouted, holding the poor squirming soldier at arm's length, and roaring with laughter. Sophie, standing at the palm of the BFG's hand, was watching horror-struck. Do something! She cried. Quick, before he eats him! Put that human being down, the BFG shouted. The flesh lump eater stared at the BFG. What is you doing here with all these twitchy groglets? He bellowed. You is making me very suspicious. The BFG made a rush at the flesh lump eater, but the colossal 54-foot-high giant simply knocked him over with a flick of his free arm. At the same time, Sophie fell off the BFG's palm onto the ground. Her mind was racing. She must do something. She must. She must. She remembered all the sapphire brooch the queen had pinned onto her chest. Quickly, she undid it. I is guzzling you nice and slow, the flesh lump eater was saying to the soldier in his hand. Then I is guzzling 10 or 20 more of you, midgy little maggots, down there. You is not getting away from me because I is galloping 50 times faster than you. Sophie ran up behind the flesh lump eater. She was holding the brooch between her fingers. When she was right up close to the great naked hairy legs, she rammed the 3-inch-long pin of the brooch as hard as she could into his right ankle. It went deep into the flesh, and it stayed there. The giant gave a roar of pain and jumped high in the air. He dropped the soldier and made a grab for his ankle. The BFG, knowing what a coward the flesh lump eater was, saw his chance. You was bitten by a snake, he shouted. I seed it biting you. It was a frightsome poison walls viper. It was a dreadly dangerous vid-screen viper. Save your souls, bellowed the flesh lump eater. Sound the crumpets. I is bitten by a suspicious, venomous, scream viper. He flopped to the ground and sat there howling his head off, clutching his ankle with both hands. His fingers felt the brooch. The tiny teeth of the dreadly viper is still sticking into me, he yelled. I is feeling the teeth sticking into my ankle. The BFG saw his second chance. We must be getting those viper's teeth at once, he cried. Obviously you is deader than duck soup. I is helping you. The BFG knelt down beside the flesh lump eater. You must grab your ankle very tight with both hands, he ordered. That will stop the poison juices from the venomous viper going up your leg and into your heart. The flesh lump eater grabbed his ankle with both hands. Now close your eyes and griddle your teeth and look up to heaven and say your prayers while I is taking out the teeth of the venomous viper, the BFG said. The terrified flesh lump eater did exactly as he was told. The BFG signaled for some rope. A soldier rushed over to it. With the flesh lump eater's hand gripping his ankle, it was a simple matter for the BFG to tie the ankles and his hands together with a tight knot. I is pulling out the frightsome viper's teeth, the BFG said as he pulled the knot tight. Do it quickly, shouted the flesh lump eater, before I is pizen to death. There we is, the BFG said, standing up. You can look now. When the flesh lump eater saw that he was trussed up like a turkey, he gave a yell so loud that the heavens trembled. He rolled, and he wriggled, and he fought, and he figgled, and he squirmed, and he squiggled, but there was not a thing that he could do. Well done, Sophie cried. Well done you, the BFG said, smiling down at the little girl. You is saving all of our lives. Will you please get that brooch back for me, Sophie said. It belongs to the queen. The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the flesh lump eater's ankle. The flesh lump eater howled. The BFG wiped the pin and handed it back to Sophie. Curiously, not one of the other 8 snoring giants had woken up during the schmozzle. When you was the only one sleeping 1 or 2 hours a day, you was sleeping extra double sleep, the BFG explained. The heads of the Army and the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeep. Her Majesty will be very pleased with me, the head of the Army said. I shall probably get a medal. What's the next move? Now you is driving all over my cave to load up my bottles of dreams, the BFG said. We can't waste time with that rubbish, the Army General said. It's the Queen's order, said Sophie. She was now back in the BFG's hand. So the 9 jeeps drove across the BFG's cave, and the great dream-loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars in all to be loaded up, with 5,000 to each jeep. It took over an hour to finish the job. When the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountains to a mysterious errand. When they came back, the BFG had a sack the size of a small house slung over his shoulder. What you got in there? The head of the Army demanded to know. Curiosity is killing the rat, the BFG said, and he turned away from the silly man. When he was sure that all of his precious dreams had been safely loaded into the jeeps, the BFG said, now he is driving back to the belly poppers and picking up the frightsome giants. The jeeps drove back to the helicopters. The 50,000 dreams were carried carefully, jar by jar, onto the helicopters. The soldiers climbed back on board, but the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants had been lying. It was a fine sight to see them, these great air machines hovering over the trestled-up giants. It was even finer to see the giants being woken up by the terrific thundering of the engines overhead. And the finest sight of all was to observe those 9 hideous brutes squirming and twisting about on the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from the ropes and the chains.